مع اقتراب مرور عام على توقيع الاتفاق المبدئي مع صندوق النقد وثلاث سنوات على بداية الأزمة، رسالة الصندوق واضحة ومكررة. لبنان بات في خطر.
Lebanon is at a very dangerous moment. It's at a crossroads. We are in a situation where the status quo, the continuation of policy inaction, we think is going to leave Lebanon in a never-ending crisis. The dollarization and cash economy is growing very rapidly. Unemployment is very high. Poverty is very high. It's been more than 3 years since the start of the crisis, and the policies necessary to turn this thing around are urgent, and they have to be very strong reforms. In a situation where the status quo continues, we would expect at a minimum stagflation. In a worst case scenario, we can be looking at hyperinflation, which will definitely be impacting the quality of life of the Lebanese for many years to come.
على مدى ساعة من الزمن حاول رئيس بعثة الصندوق تلطيف المصطلحات، لكن المضمون واضح: مماطلة من الجانب اللبناني للتوصل إلى اتفاق مع الصندوق، وكل التقدم المنجز بحاجة إلى مراجعة.
Parliament, as far as we know, could still progress with some of these pieces of legislation, particularly things like the capital controls law, the bank secrecy law, which did not at the end completely meet all the requirements that we wanted. They could revisit that. And they could also look at the bank resolution legislation, which is a piece of legislation that sooner or later is going to have to be used. And is in very good shape as far as we know now. Our colleagues are working still on some additional changes, but the 14 bank evaluation has not been started, in part because the bank secrecy law, the way it was passed, would not provide enough coverage so that the evaluation can be properly completed. So that's unfortunately for the moment there are no new estimates. It's almost a year since we reached that agreement. Normally we would have expected by now to be at the board, which automatically will trigger the need to revise numerically the macroeconomic framework, the timetables of the things that need to implement it. But having said that, when it comes to the design of the policies that would have to be done, things will not change.
أعرب راميريز عن عدم موافقة الصندوق على صيغة الكابيتال كنترول الأخيرة على الرغم من كل ما تم ترويجه.
The objective of the capital control law is twofold. One is to protect the liquidity that is left in Lebanon to ensure that there is a fair distribution and provide few possibilities on how to deal with the losses. And also secondly, to make sure that people get to access those deposits on the basis of what is it for rather than who do they know. In that sense, the capital controls legislation that is being revised in Parliament does not, in our opinion, meet the required objectives.
أما للمنادين بالدولة كحل فجواب الصندوق كان مباشرا.
There has been a very rapid dollarization of the economy. It's fine for those that have dollars, but it's not so fine for everybody else that is receiving a payment in Lebanese pounds. The cost of living has increased dramatically. Inflation is in triple digits, which is basically impacting generally. Inflation of that nature impacts most the ones that have the least income capacities.
من صندوق سيادي لإدارة الأصول إلى صندوق لاسترداد الودائع، حلول كثيرة تم ترويجها لبنانيا نسفها الصندوق بشكل واضح.
Now when it goes further than that and it goes into the use of this type of sovereign wealth fund to repay depositors, that's where I think it is a major concern of ours. The fact that people that are not bancarized, people that have not participated, even new generations will be saddled with the losses that were generated by past generations. So it's an issue of intergenerational equity as much as an issue of capacity to do it. It's not something that originally we had agreed. I want to be very clear about that. Is something that can potentially, depending on the structure, actually deliver unsustainable debt, because essentially if the government takes on the liability, if for the future, that will be difficult for Lebanon to be able to meet that type of obligations.
أما القطاع المصرفي الذي يصر على أن مشكلته هي السيولة فقط، فللصندوق رأي آخر.
When you evaluate the banking system, there are, of course, you have to look at it from the balance sheet perspective and for the flow perspective. So one is liquidity, the other one is solvency. When you do the solvency evaluation and you look at the balance sheet where the liabilities far exceed the total amount of the assets, you have a capital gap. And whether the system is bankrupt, insolvent, you can call it whichever way you want, essentially you do have a system which lacks liquidity and a system that is lacking capital at this point.
في المحصلة وبعد عام على الاتفاق المبدئي وعلى الرغم من تأكيد البعثة استمرار تعاونها مع لبنان إلا أن الخلاصة بسيطة وواضحة، هيك مش ماشي الحال. أنا شمس الدين، قناة الجديد.